Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome to the latest edition of our Center for Wildlife Studies Wildlife Chronicles webinars. My name is Vinni Jain. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Wildlife Studies. And since the pandemic, since 2020, we've been doing this series of online webinars. And since that time, we've covered like a wide range of topics in conservation, from human-wildlife interactions, art and storytelling, to snakes and elephants and tigers. And if you ever want to check out our past webinars, you can visit our YouTube channel. And if you ever want to contribute to our work or reach out to us, you can contact us at outreach@cwsindia.org. And today's webinar is about an amazing topic. It's about bird conservation in changing landscapes in India and worldwide. Today we have two amazing speakers. We have Dr. Ghazala Shahabuddin. Dr. Ghazala has a PhD in ecology and in the environment in Bangalore. And she's also a visiting professor in environmental studies at Ashoka University. She's also a founder and member of the Center for Ecology Development and Research in Delhi, where she was a senior fellow from 2007 to 2021. She's done extensive research on ornithology, protected areas, forestry, conservation policies, and politics in India. Dr. Umesh Srinivasan has a PhD from the National Center for Biological Sciences, NCBS, in Bangalore, and he completed his postdoc in Princeton University. He's currently an assistant professor at the Indian Institute for Science in Bangalore, and he studies how various human-induced forest changes impact biodiversity, especially birds. He's done considerable research on how multiple species associate with each other to form mixed species flocks. And he currently works with various institutions to study how climate change and forest degradation impact Himalayan birds in Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and Sikkim. So welcome, Dr. Umesh and Dr. Ghazala.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here and see so many interested people online.
So yeah, let's get right into it. So both of you have done research on various aspects of conservation, but a common theme in your research has been birds. So what was it that got you interested in bird ecology and in conservation? And what was it about birds that drew you to them? Dr. Ghazala, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think I got interested in birds like I guess a lot of people here would have, just watching birds around them when they're growing up. I was lucky to be growing up in a city like Delhi, which one of the richest urban centers for birds across the world. And, it's just fantastic to see things, when you're growing up and you get interested in that particular. And birds are quite resilient also. You see a lot of them around you. So you get interested in that. And also, I was also lucky to be part of this environmental group called Kalpavriksha. And we actually started systematic bird counts in 10 spots around Delhi. And that really got me thinking about human impacts and birds. So that's how I really started.
Thank you. What about you, Dr. Umesh?
Well, I can't remember a time that I was not interested in birds. I can't really chart when my interest in birds actually began, but I'm just interested in wildlife in general. I ended up studying birds because they're conspicuous and because they're easy to study than studying snakes, for example. So, but now I only study birds and nothing else.
So why do you think that birds are a good group to study to answer overarching questions about conservation or about wildlife? Are birds a good way to study these questions? And if so, like why?
I think so. I mean, from all of the information out there now and the studies that have been done, you can see that there's a very strong correlation between bird diversity and diversity of numerous other taxa, including reptiles, amphibians, plants. So birds are a very good surrogate for trying to understand landscape change, is my view. And at the more local scales, it gets a little more difficult, of course. But as as everyone knows, they're easy to see compared to other taxa, easy to record. So good indicators overall.
And the other thing is, I completely echo Ghazala here. The other thing is that compared to other taxonomic groups, we know a lot more baseline stuff about birds than other taxonomic groups. So if you want to know just, the ecology of birds, the physiology, the anatomy, and so on and so forth, we know a lot about this compared with, let's say, lizards or even plants.
Is that because they're more conspicuous and more easy to spot?
Well, I think a lot of people have been interested in birds for a long, long time. They sing, they fly. I think flight is one of those things that people find very, very fascinating. And, and so people have focused on birds for a very, very long time. From Aristotle's time, thinking about, why do birds migrate and where do these swallows suddenly appear from, when it becomes summer. So people have been interested in birds for a long time, probably because they fly and they're conspicuous, they sing. And so they're sort of been part of histories and cultures for a very long time.
Wow, that's very interesting. So both of you answer a lot of research questions or have answered a lot of research questions about birds. So what field or lab methods do you use to answer these questions? And is there any particular method of data collection that you personally enjoy the most?
Umesh, you go first.
All right, so we study climate change and habitat change and how that affects bird population dynamics. So we're interested in understanding how birds survive from one year to the next. Is that survival probability dropping? We're interested in asking if climate change is causing the morphology of birds, just the body shape and the size of birds to change. And so to do this, we use a method called mist netting, which is we put out mist nets in the forest and the birds get caught in these nets and we take them out. And this is people who are highly trained, you can't go out and put up a mist net on your own without a lot of training. So you have to be trained in it and you have to have the relevant permissions from the forest department. So that's what we do. So we have the bird in the hand and we ring them with numbered aluminum rings and we weigh them and we measure a whole lot of other stuff about them as well. And that's what we do. And those are the methods that we use. So it's basically trying to track an individual across time to see on average in the population, how are survival trends changing because of climate change and because of habitat degradation.
And you do this by capturing and marking individual birds, right? And
That's
then
right. So
capturing them again.
Capture these birds and mark them with this uniquely numbered aluminium ring, which is like a bangle on the bird's leg. And then we go back the next year to exactly the same locations and see how many fresh birds we've got and see how many new birds we're catching. And so that's what we do.
Great. What about you, Ghazala?
So I've been really interested, like the more I look at the literature and the more I involve myself in bird research, I find that we are really getting away from field studies and more people are publishing really large-scale studies that answer very important questions, but based on secondary data. And one of my aims really is to unearth more localized information about birds, So if you take the simple case of Western Himalayan birds, you'd be surprised to know that for most of them, we don't even have basic data on where they live, how, of course, we know how they nest, but, how are they responding to changes? What is the diversity, in monocultures and how is land use change really impacting them? And these are the things that we can only know by field observation. So most of my work is really based on very intensive field observations. And particularly just occurrence and in addition, looking at plant-animal interactions, how birds utilize certain spaces, certain kinds of niches or certain plants, how opportunistic they are or how specialized they are. So a lot of my work is just field-based and small-scale studies. Yeah.
And so in this, you observe the bird's behavior. It's like behavioral observations.
Yeah, in addition to just surveying them, we look closely at behavior and how they behave in the habitat and what they are using, their habitat utilization and so on. but no specific methods we use. Yeah, we just observe.
Great, great. And so both of you have worked in various landscapes in India, outside India. In all of the landscapes you've worked, why did you choose them and what makes them unique? And how are these landscapes changing? Have you personally witnessed landscapes changing when you have worked on them over time?
Yeah, I think that Umesh and I both have a lot of horror stories to share, but don't want to scare the young people here. But I think that, the reason I chose the areas that I work in is because I was always interested in looking at human habitat, human wildlife interactions, and how, what are we really doing to our forests and our wetlands, if you see the policies of the government, they're very, very general. If you see dense forest cover, you just assume, okay, this is great for all of our biota. But when you actually go into the depth of it, you figure out that there are certain very chronic and very, very overall, changes that don't look very drastic, but which have strong influences on bird behavior, bird ecology, foraging and nesting. So my aim has always been to look at different kinds of landscape where there's tremendous human use. And for that, I was in Sariska Tiger Reserve for a while. And then I've been in the Western Himalayas for 10 years. And your second question about land use change, it's truly frightening what kind of changes are happening. Even during the last 10 years that I have been there, in my small landscape, I've seen enormous amount of fragmentation and edge effects taking place, all kinds of degradation happening. There are also some good news. Certain landscapes are now recovering from very heavy use and extraction because of lowering intensity of grazing and firewood collection. So that's good news, and we plan to look at that more carefully. But all of the positive effects are being really being they're not really showing up because there are other things happening in the landscape, like huge infrastructure development and tourism that's taking away all the good parts. So that's a lot of things happening simultaneously.
What about you, Umesh?
Well, I've always been, a huge fan of biodiversity. The higher the diversity at a location, the more I'm a fan of that location. And, the Eastern Himalayas, as far as birds are concerned, is the second most biodiverse location on Earth, and by far the most biodiverse location in our country. And what that allows us to do in our research is to also be able to study species that differ very much in their traits. You've got small species, you've got large species, you've got species that feed on insects, you've got species that feed on fruit. And if you're asking questions like, how does climate change impact different kinds of species, then we've got that variation to work with. We've got that, heterogeneity and all of that information there. And we can ask questions like, are insectivores more vulnerable to climate change than frugivores? And why would that be? And so that's why we've been working in the Eastern Himalayas, our team and us. And I think this kind of research is becoming more relevant now, given that the Eastern Himalayas is warming about 3 times as fast as the global average. And we're actually seeing the impacts of climate change on birds in the Eastern Himalayas, even with the last 12, 13 years of data collection that we have. But yeah, we could get into that a little later, maybe.
And have you seen the Eastern Himalayas changing while you've worked there?
Yes, we've certainly seen it becoming warmer and warmer in the last 15 years. We're also seeing changes in rainfall patterns where, months where it would be dry are now wet. And the monsoon, although the amount of rainfall that falls is the same, it's compressed into a much shorter time period. And that has various other effects, right? Because birds are timing their life cycles to coincide with evolutionary time, the kind of weather patterns and the kind of climates that were present. But now we also see a lot more extreme events like hailstorms. And hailstorms at the peak of the breeding season can, destroy huge percentages of nests.
So all of this is happening, definitely.
Right. So this leads me to my next question, which, some of our audience might not be familiar with this. How do these different climatic and geographic variables, how do they shape or impact bird communities, generally speaking? What has your research shown?
Well, generally speaking, I think the sort of the two important things that influence bird communities are temperature and rainfall. And basically, you find the most biodiverse bird communities where it's hot and wet, and that's the tropics, basically. And then, so what you basically have is a bunch of birds that can potentially colonize a location, that can potentially live in a location based on their physiological requirements, based on their thermal adaptation, based on their requirements for rainfall and so on. And then the habitat acts as a filter. And from that entire set of birds, a certain subset then forms the community at that location. And that subset is formed of species that are able to tolerate the abiotic conditions at that location. But what we're seeing with our research is that if you log the forest, if you selectively log the forest, and you're removing a subset of the trees that are commercially important for some reason, and so you're not clear felling the forest, but you're just changing the structure, you're opening up the canopy, you're bringing a lot more solar radiation down into the understory, which leads to the proliferation of vegetation on the ground. Now that changes a whole lot of things. So log forest, for instance, is on average 2 degrees Celsius hotter than primary forest. It loses the buffering effect of the canopy. And so it's colder at night, but warmer during the day. It's 20% less humid because all that humidity is just escaping from log forest. And that changes the arthropod communities, which most of these birds are feeding on. And so you see birds that are unable to find their temperature humidity niches in log forest, the niches that they would ideally occupy in primary forest, that they don't find that in log forest because it's hotter and drier. These are the birds that are showing the steepest survival declines. These are the birds that have actually reduced in body size over the last 13 years. The body size reductions because smaller birds can lose heat easily. And so maybe that's what is selected, that the habitat is selecting for individuals that are smaller because they're able to survive in those warmer environments.
Okay. And
I'd just like to add to that, actually. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
That in places like the Himalayas, actually, along with all of these changes and anthropogenically induced changes, the whole elevational gradient is so critical to bird diversity. I mean, a single state like Uttarakhand, for instance, there's been at least 700 species recorded or 600 species recorded. It's just incredible, and that's because you have this incredibly steep gradient of temperatures, and the associated vegetation, which can differ dramatically from even 200 meters upslope and downslope. So you have this incredible diversity that is being nurtured right from the base of the Himalayas all the way to the top. So that also, I think, is a very important gradient to look at, along with all of the abiotic gradients as well.
So that kind of means that where it's hot and wet and where there's a lot of elevation gradient, it's basically a hot spot for diversification for birds. Yeah.
The Himalayas are definitely, along with Western Ghats and, other parts of, Andaman and Nicobar Islands and so on.
Yeah. So I had a follow-up question for Umesh. So you said that a lot of birds are in logged forests are going down in body size, and they're facing a lot of changes because of opening up of the canopy. What birds, can you give examples of those birds, and also how much of the forest in the areas that you study is primary forest versus how much is logged forest? Is there a lot of primary forest left?
I don't think there's any primary forest left pretty much anywhere in the world. What we're dealing with is what is called old growth forest. I mean, we use the word primary, but it's technically not really correct. What we're studying is old growth forest, and that's forest that has regenerated and reached some kind of structure and composition. So almost everywhere in the world, forest has been used. It's been burnt, it's been replaced with agriculture. Some places it's come back. So in Arunachal Pradesh, the land tenure system is very unlike the rest of the country. 80% of Arunachal is forested, and 60% of Arunachal is actually administered at the village level by village councils. And so the village owns the land. The village makes decisions about where, like our typical protected area models in the rest of the country, the forest is very much open to use. And a large part of Arunachal is still old growth. But the replacement of this old growth, especially with monoculture plantations, is a huge danger, with things like rubber, oil palm, other kind of monoculture plantations. That's areca. That's happening, and that's a worry, because the even the areas that are cleared for agriculture and then regenerating at various ages, they support a whole lot of biodiversity, because you have this mix of different kinds of habitats. Whereas you replace all of that with a monoculture plantation, and then that's just death for biodiversity.
Right. And what bird species have you seen that have become smaller in size, or which have, have been impacted because of this?
We've got species like the white-tailed robin. We've got species like the rusty-fronted barwing. We've also got pretty small species, like the white-gorgeted flycatcher. And these are all showing both declines in survival rates and declines in body size. And we think the two might be related to each other, where you lose body mass and you're a poor quality individual and more likely to die than survive from one year to the next.
Right. And Ghazala, have you seen these sorts of changes even in Sariska or in places outside of the Himalayas?
So what we're finding, like the 3 or 4 places that I've worked, and so we haven't made the kind of measurements that Umesh is routinely doing in his work. But we are finding other kinds of trends that are looking more and more pervasive across India. For instance, early on in our study, we actually wrote about this back in 2004 with my student, that insectivores are really most vulnerable to all of this habitat change. Like Umesh is talking about logging. I could talk about, lopping for firewood or grazing or, fragmentation because of roads. All that is leading to a certain kind of, certain groups of birds being selected over others. And insectivores are really most susceptible, and recent studies globally have shown this to be true. The second thing that I'm seeing now is, the specialist versus generalist kind of a dichotomy. Across the studies, and I think Umesh would agree with me that very often when you have a human-induced change in the landscape, like logging or you have grazing, you may not find a reduction in overall diversity of birds that you're going to count over there. But you will see a change in the numbers of specialists or habitat specialists that actually use particular habitats in a very specialized and adapted way. For instance, a simple example, like you have a desert ecosystem, and if you start growing trees all over the place, which our forest department unfortunately does in many states, you find that the desert dwelling birds suffer. Birds like sand grouse and bustards and floricans, these are the ones that actually will be affected. So I think it's the habitat specialists and the insectivores. So these are the kind of trends that I'm noticing across all of my study sites. In the Himalayas, we found a dramatic drop of almost 90% in the number of birds belonging to specialist guilds compared to birds belonging to generalist guilds that are equally at home feeding in orchards versus agriculture and forest. They are generalist birds. But in my field site, for instance, birds like the brown wood owl, the maroon oriole, a tiny bird like the black-faced warbler, you'll never see it in the youth forest. You'll always see it in the substantially large forests that are in very good shape comparatively, like the old growth forests that haven't been logged for at least 50 to 60 years. So these are the kind of trends at the community level that I'm able to observe.
Right. Umesh, you also study mixed species bird flocks. So I wanted to ask you, why do mixed species flocks form, and why are they important, and how are they being affected by these changes?
Oh, mixed flocks are crucial for the survival of certain species in the subcontinent. In Africa and Asia, unlike in South America, which has a different sort of flocking system, flocks form during the dry, cold season. That's when arthropods abundances are low. So it's almost only insectivorous birds that are forming mixed flocks. And the reason why they form is that, unlike a group of individuals of all of which are the same species, you're going to compete with each other for the same resources, right? Me as an individual and you as an individual eating the same things are going to compete with each other for the same resources. But the amount of competition in a mixed flock is lower because every species has a slightly different requirement in terms of what it's eating. And there are all these sort of mutualistic benefits that are being exchanged in mixed flocks. One species that's very good at warning against predators. And so other species would want to associate with it because it gives them early warning against predation. The other species might be traveling in family groups, and because they travel in family groups, they're disturbing the vegetation, causing insects to fly out. And those insects then become accessible to the early warning bird, which would not have had those insects accessible to it because it feeds on insects that are in flight. And so you've got these exchanges of benefits happening. And some of our research has shown that with logging, if you look at survival rates of birds, birds that form mixed species flocks have the same survival rates in primary forest and in log forest. So the flocking behavior in itself seems to be something that allows species to overcome resource crunches, higher predation risk, and we see that the flock also changes subtly between primary and log forest in terms of what species are participating in. Species that are genetically hardwired to never form mixed flocks, species that always forest solitarily, and they will never join a mixed flock, they actually show a 30% reduction in survival rate in log forest. So that behavior of flocking itself is crucial for the survival of species, especially during that winter period.
So I have two questions about this. How many species are there generally in a mixed species flock? And also a species that never joins this kind of flock. Do you think that with climate changes or habitat changes, it would start joining the flocks, or is that behavior not like a plastic or changeable behavior?
No, I don't. That's not a behavior that can change, over time. It's sort of evolutionarily hardwired. It's ingrained. Like a white-tailed robin can't wake up today and say, "I'm going to join the yellow-throated falvetta." So that's how. In terms of the number of species that join flocks, it varies a lot. And there are different flock systems as well. There's a flock type in the canopy, there's a flock in the understory, there's another large-bodied flock made up of laughing thrushes and broncos and trogons and green magpie and so on, which is in the understory. But on average, maybe 5 or 6 species would be the norm. But it can range from 2 to I have seen flocks with 40 species. So, it's quite variable, but 5 or 6 species.
That's super interesting. So my next question for both of you is, okay, so we spoke a bit about land use changes and how they affect birds. So how do things like logging and fragmentation and like infrastructure affect birds? But how does climate change affect bird communities? And are those changes happening now? And or do we expect even more changes in the future? And right now is just the beginning. Umesh, do you want to answer first?
I can do that. I mean, like Ghazala was saying, these are all called global change drivers, fragmentation, invasive species, climate change, and so on. And like Ghazala was pointing out, when it comes to bird communities, it's the insectivores and the specialists that lose out. And so what we see with land use change is this what's called biotic homogenization. It's all of these small fragments, altered habitats, urban spaces are selecting for species that are generally small, that are generally specialist, and that have high dispersal ability. They can move from one place to the other. So what you lose because of all of these things, habitat fragmentation, logging, agriculture, and so on, you're losing large species, you're losing specialist species, and you're losing species that are sedentary, species that cannot move from one place to the other. So that's sort of this large effect that global change drivers are having, which is homogenizing communities in terms of their traits. So you end up with a community that is functionally much less effective than an intact forest or an intact habitat community. With climate change, what's happening is wholesale range shifts. So if you look at mountains, for example, and you've got a bird that in 1900 occupied 500 meters to 1500 meters in elevation on the mountainside. So it was not found below 1500 meters, 500 meters, not found above 1500 meters. That bird now, to keep pace with climate change, if a 1 degree Celsius rise occurs and it has to remain at the same temperature, then it needs to shift up, because the entire temperatures decline as you go higher up, and that entire gradient is shifting up with climate change, right? So if you found 20 degrees Celsius at 500 meters in 1900, today 20 degrees Celsius might be at 1,000 meters. And so the bird, to remain at the same temperatures, that population now needs to move up. That's happening all over the world in tropical mountains. And it's a scary thing, because these birds are going to reach the tops of these mountains, run out of space, and go locally extinct. That's already happened in the Andes, in some mountain regions. So climate change is causing these range shifts. And they're also causing it's also causing latitudinal range shifts, where species are moving away from the tropics towards the poles, because that's cooler, and the higher latitudes are cooler. So that's one huge impact, and we don't know what's going to happen, because with mixed species flocks, for instance, if you've got one species moving out of a habitat and the other species is left behind, and both of them used to associate with flocks, now when that interaction is broken, what happens to survival of these species? Now you have new interactions where you've got species coming in up from below and meeting species it would never have met in the absence of climate change. And we still don't know how that's going to play out. That's one important thing. And the other important thing is, of course, mismatches between prey and predator emergence, right? So some birds might use day length to migrate, whereas insects might use temperatures to actually emerge from their pupae. And so because temperatures are getting warmer, the caterpillars are out earlier. But the bird is not using temperature to reach those feeding grounds. It's using day length. And so now by the time it comes and lays its eggs, that massive boom in caterpillar biomass, that caterpillar supply is gone, it's over. And so you've got these mismatches in timings that are causing huge impacts because of climate change.
One thing I wanted to add here was, of course, the impacts of climate change are now very visible, particularly in places where, Umesh has actually been tracking these changes. But what is even scarier now is that, these climate change impacts seem to be synergizing with land use change impacts to cause even worse situation for birds, So for instance, in the Western Himalayas, if you go really high up and you go to, deforested areas or areas cleared for agriculture, you'll find a lot of species which are very generalist that have been able to sort of climb up the mountain because they are responding to climate change, but they are also able to use these deforested or degraded habitats much more than the forest specialists or the grassland specialists that require certain kinds of habitat. Yeah, so the effects are actually going to be worse than what we are actually recording right now, just based on individual impacts. So it's going to be worse. Yeah.
So
I
you.
want to add to that.
Sorry, continue. Yeah.
So basically, in mountains, Ghazala and I both studied birds in mountains. In mountains, you have this natural gradient in temperature that is shifting upwards. And on top of that, you have this gradient of land use, which is making altered habitats far hotter and far less humid. And both of them put together, it's like a perfect storm, when it comes to birds. And it is going to get, sorry to sound pessimistic, but it is going to get way worse. With even primary forests or old growth forest habitats becoming drier from climate change and so on.
Yes.
It's not looking good.
The other thing you notice is that when the birds are shifting upwards in response to temperature change, they're also coming in contact with their congeners, with whom they're likely to have much higher levels of competition. And what would be very interesting, like in our field site, we've started observing certain species of woodpeckers becoming much commoner than they were even 5 years ago. So, and all of these woodpeckers are getting into the best habitat. So, what is going to be the effect of this added level of competition for some of the habitat specialists in these zones? That is something to be studied. In fact, earlier this year, I saw some very interesting interactions between chestnut-bellied nuthatches that only go up to 1800 meters and white-bellied nuthatches white-tailed nuthatches that were interacting at the edge of the forest. They were having agonistic interactions. They were fighting over space, and this could be a portent of things to come.
So you guys mentioned that a lot of these changes will homogenize the bird diversity, and it will also lead to certain species either shifting or completely going extinct. So one question which might be very basic, but why should we care? Like, why should we care if birds go extinct, or why should we care if the bird diversity is getting homogenized? What is the how does this impact larger forests, ecology, or how does it impact people?
I think that, we have to make us, obviously, there are a lot of species. You might have, 500 species in a particular protected area. And of course, most of them don't have any visible kind of use for human beings or, even culturally or for pollination or for anything, right? So I think as a society, we have to really make a decision, are these things important to us or not? Is biodiversity important? And there's increasing amount of information that the more diverse ecosystems are, the more efficient ecosystem services are. Many of the services that we're talking about, that everyone's talking about, payment for ecosystem services and such things, they're only possible if we have a very diverse ecosystem. Diversity begets a stability to a large extent in many cases. And so I think that, it's not easy to quantify all of these benefits, but I think that it's an ethical question at one end. It is also a scientific question. We'll be losing so much of information about the evolution of birds, about their behavior, about so many adaptations that they have. Are we happy to live in a world that is so homogenized and so simplified, or are we going to do something about it? Is my view on it.
I mean, like Ghazala says, it is a moral question, right? The question is partly a question of morality. But I just want to add to what Ghazala said in terms of benefits that birds provide to human beings, and this is purely material economic benefits by rare birds. Now, rare birds, by the very fact that they're rare, are not likely to have substantial benefit or substantial impacts on the ecosystem. It's likely to be the more common species that are doing the pollination and the dispersal and so on. The rare birds are not perhaps contributing as much as the more common species, but it's the rare birds that people come to see. And you lose the rare birds, you're losing a substantial amount of very low impact, high value tourism. So in our in our field site, we have this bird species called the Bugun-Leochicla. The Bugun-Leochicla has a global range of about 2 square kilometers. And the known global population of this bird is between 14 and 20 individuals. So it's like a fifth of the number of people on this chat right now is the population of the Bugun-Leochicla, the global population of the Bugun-Leochicla. So people come from all over the world to see this bird. And it's transformed the economy of this place. It's, completely transformed the economy. People from the villages surrounding there have become expert bird guides. They work as cooks, they work as drivers, they work as camp staff and so on. Remove the Bugun-Leochicla, all that disappears. So it's also provided huge economic impetus to at least our location.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, that's very true for Western Himalayas also. The kind of surge that is happening in bird-based tourism is just incredible. More and more people are coming to various altitudes, to various kinds of forests and wetlands to see particular birds, not just rare birds, but just to enjoy the bird diversity there, to enjoy the habitats and the views and everything that goes with it. And in the Western Himalayas, what's really interesting is that you see a lot more birds, just around you. People are very tolerant of birds. There's much less hunting. And so you see a lot of birds just at very, in very close distance. And so for bird watching also, it's a great place. And there's been a surge of, bird watching and training of local people as guides, like Umesh is saying. We have similar programs going on in the Western Himalayas, in which local youth are being trained, local people are being trained to run nature-linked tourism and bird watching walks and so on.
So a lot of this sounds very like pessimistic, and climate change and land use change are clearly taking like a huge toll. So what do you feel like are the solutions to these problems? Are there any solutions? And if so, what do you think we need to do as like individuals or as a society or like governments? What do you think is like the way forward to make sure that our bird diversity remains intact in the Himalayas and across India?
I can start. I'm sure that both of us have been involved in this. And I think that one of the basic problems is that currently there doesn't seem to be any political will to retain our habitats, our natural ecosystems, our not just bird diversity, but everything that goes with it. As I said earlier, wherever there's high bird diversity, there's likely to be high plant diversity, high reptile diversity. I mean, it's all connected, right? So I think we need a strong political backing for all of the conservation that's going on in the country. And in terms of actually what should be done, I think that strict protection is absolutely necessary. The more I work, the more I realize is that you do need strictly protected landscapes to a great extent. You need multiple use landscapes, which are anyway happening. People are using landscapes. You need regulation of infrastructure. You need regulation of forest use. And most of these laws are in place. It's just that we don't have a strong leadership within the country, either at the state level or national level, that can help us guard these landscapes. We can literally see habitats going down under and in front of our eyes. So I think as all the young people here and the older people here, I think we need to get involved in kind of pushing for both, implementing these laws properly wherever they are available, and also against the dilution of many of these laws that are allowing a lot of unplanned infrastructure to come up all over the place. So we did have very strong laws that weren't implemented, but now I see a gradual dilution, in favor of, this whole development paradigm that we have, that the more bridges we have, the more roads we have, the better off that we are going to be. So I think political will is what's lacking today, really.
Umesh, do you
I agree with Ghazala that we can't afford to lose any more of the natural habitats that we have left. That should be absolutely non-negotiable. But also, I just wanted to point out that the legal framework under which conservation in India operates is quite archaic. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 was meant to halt the rapid decline of charismatic large mammal populations, and it was great for them. But now our threats are different. Our threats are climate change, our threats are invasive species, and that act has not kept up with the times. And it does not allow even forest managers to deal with, for example, invasive species coming into their habitats, because things like spraying pesticides and all of that is out of the question because the act is so strict. That said, I think the most important thing in the context of climate change is to provide connectivity between habitats. Populations are going to move, species are going to shift their ranges. And we cannot afford to have isolated patches of protected areas with no connectivity between them. We can't afford to protect one particular elevation on a mountainside and not protect. So you need that entire elevational gradient protected so that species can move up and survive even though there's climate change.
Right. So I think, can you hear me? Yeah. So before we move on to the audience Q&A, I'll just ask you one final question, which is, have you guys seen any success stories in your landscape of bird conservation being done effectively? Or have there been no success stories?
Okay, I'll go first. I think one of the things, I find, of course, the forest departments across the country are being vilified, for not being effective enough, for keeping people out of, wetlands and forests, not allowing them to use them. But at least in Uttarakhand, what I've seen is that, there are still large patches of native forest remaining. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there has been significant amount of protection after independence that the forest department was able to do. So I would see that as a kind of a semi-success story. And at the local level, I find that there are a lot of communities that are really now worried and working hard to protect forests. Some of the best forest patches I've seen in Uttarakhand are actually also protected by communities. So there are numerous success stories. It's just that the role of government in land use planning and infrastructure development is so overwhelming across our country that very few other pressure groups have any say at all. And I think that's where we need the change. We need more voices, both scientists and local communities and sane voices in the forest department to do what they're supposed to be doing. So yeah, there are success stories. It just needs to be replicated across, and it's very, very few and far between is what I would say.
Umesh, do you have anything to add?
Because I work in Arunachal, and the systems are very different in Arunachal than the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, it's all centralized. The decisions come to the top and they flow down. Whereas in Arunachal, it's much more decentralized, and the Bugun community of Singchung village, on whose lands the Bougainvillea ochikla is found, have actually declared 32 square kilometers of their land as a community reserve to protect the Bougainvillea ochikla and to protect other threatened Himalayan wildlife. And luckily, with scientists working in that area, camera trapping and looking for mammals, herpetologists looking for snakes and lizards and butterfly people and bird people, and our results on climate change showing that these species are moving up. And if you want to create a reserve, let's have this reserve go from the lowest possible elevation to the highest possible elevation, so that these birds and other wildlife can move up and survive, even though they will move up, so that they don't hit a band of vegetation that has been cleared or farmed. And so actually this reserve now spans a 2,000 meter elevational gradient. It goes from 1,200 meters to 3,200 meters. And at least for this location, the immense generosity of the Bugun community of Singchung village to have declared a part of their land, more than a third of their land, as a community reserve.
That's very interesting. So you think that community reserves are successful in Arunachal Pradesh?
I think that model, because administration and land tenure is so decentralized, the model is rich for replication in Northeast India.
Right. So I'll go to some of the audience questions now, because we're getting a lot of them. So one question is there. Could you throw some light on what sort of infrastructure projects are being implemented in the Western Himalayas, and how are they impacting bird communities? And if you could share some specific bird examples, that would be great.
So unfortunately, about specific bird species, there's not been enough study. Most of the work has been done by Wildlife Institute so far, and with the limited time that is given to these institutes to actually do an environmental impact assessment, it's sad, but that's the way it is. What's happening in the Western Himalayas right now is, first of all, a large scale push towards large dams and medium scale dams, hydroelectric power projects. So that's one big issue over there. And many of these dams have already, all of you who read the news would know that some of these dams actually got washed away during the glacial meltdown last year. There's also a push towards increasing connectivity through highways. And in a fragile, a place like Himalayas with fragile slopes and so on, this is actually leading to a whole lot of landslides, particularly when there are, more and more frequent flood situations. So these are the kind of, these two major infrastructural impacts are there right now. And, they're having major impacts on all sorts of habitats. They're having impacts on villages also. People in villages have actually been cut off because of the landslides and so on. So it's not just having an impact on birds, it's also people's lives that we are playing with. So that's one thing. The kind of, just looking at the larger picture of birds in the Western Himalayas, I would guess that the kind of birds that are being affected are all sorts and all the kind of habitats. The middle Himalayas seem to be most impacted, where the hardwood forests are and which are the richest in terms of birds. Because, where you have, the high altitude meadows and so on are still a little bit, not affected and not penetrated by this boom in infrastructure. So I think that the entire bird community is affected. And as I said earlier, our work shows that forest specialists, large birds like pheasants and hornbills are really affected. Insectivores are badly affected. So there are groups of birds guilds that are going to be very affected in future as well.
Do you have anything to add, Umesh?
No, I think Ghazala's perfectly right. And it's just runaway infrastructure in the Himalayas, especially because the Himalayas are border regions and so they become militarily important as well. And so things are just pushed through without consideration of ecologies and,
Yeah. There's another question. How fast are the anatomical changes in birds with the current ecological and climate change? Can we witness these anatomical changes in our lifetime? And are there any major changes in the migration routes of species? And if you have any examples.
Umesh?
Right now, the exact rates in terms of meters per year, in terms of moving up, I will not be able to tell you, but I can tell you that 10 years back, when we were mistletting on our plots, we misted at 2,000 meters above sea level. So it's a mid-elevation in the Himalayas. And at the thought of a low-elevation bird, like the grey-throated babbler, or the green magpie, or the long-tailed broadbill, or the sultan tit, being at 2,000 meters was unthinkable. Because they would maximum go up to about 1,600, 1,700 meters above sea level. Today, they're common in our plots at 2,000 meters. So in a 10-year period, they've moved up at least 300 meters. And so the shift is real, the shift is large. In terms of migratory routes, I don't think climate change might have affected migratory routes as much as it might have affected migratory timings, one, and also the probability of birds staying over in their wintering grounds over the winter. So, 10 years back, 20 years back, 30 years back, if you found a bird that was a migrant and it came south for the winter, you would not imagine that bird would not fly south for the winter. Now there are birds that breed at higher latitudes, they breed up north, but they stay in winter also up north because the temperatures have become so much more mild. And so that's changed with climate change. The timings of migration have changed. Birds are spending longer time in their breeding grounds than they would otherwise.
Right. There's another question about reforestation of degraded forest lands. So someone says that we are trying to restore degraded forest lands. For example, in Sariska, where planting species like Tortilis and Nilotica are being clear-felled and reforested with fruit species. So will this be beneficial for the current bird species in thorn forest ecosystems, or will it not be beneficial to replace some of the existing species with fruit species?
Absolutely not. I mean, these scrub tropical dry forests, scrub forest habitats, Anogenesis pendula dominated habitats, these are very, very specific to, these areas, to the Aravallis, and trying to replace them with fruit trees because that's the easiest thing to plant and you have a lot of seedlings out there ready to be bought and sold. It's absolutely unscientific. And there's been a lot of work already, a lot of scientists writing about this. The way that we afforest is really unscientific in India, and we are destroying the original habitat completely because birds require that sort of diversity of the native forests in order to survive. You're going to change the bird life if we plant these trees that don't belong there. And it's not like we don't know enough. We've got enough documentation from the time of Champion and Sate and even earlier. What species used to exist in what part of India. So there's no reason to be planting all these exotic, or non-native trees. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
And I just wanted to add that, there are restoration experts out there who know how to replant scrub forest and, grassland areas. There are botanists like Vijay Dasmana, Pradeep Krishan, they know what needs to go where and, how to germinate the seedlings. It's all documented. So there's no reason for Forest Department to be doing this.
Right. There's a question for Umesh. What are the suggestions and practical ideas that the Forest Department of Arunachal Pradesh can implement with the local communities for bird conservation when they seek land ownership and they still practice their indigenous traditional customs?
So the typical protected area model is where the land ownership is by the government. Now, under the Wildlife Protection Act, there are 4 kinds of protected areas. There's the national parks, the wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves, and conservation reserves. Now, in the community reserve model, the land does not go to the Forest Department. The land is not owned by the government. The land remains owned by the community. The management of the land is also by the community. It's not by the Forest Department. And the DFO, the Divisional Forest Officer of that area, is by just ex officio, a member of the management committee as a Forest Department representative. But the decisions are still taken by the community entirely, and the land ownership, land tenure remains with the community.
Right. We'll have one final question, and then we'll wrap it up. So one question is, do we have any idea on how much agriculture, chemical and industrial has destroyed bird diversity and populations in India?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Have any idea on how much agriculture has destroyed bird diversity and populations in India? So both chemical and industrial agriculture.
Actually, that's a really interesting question. So there is a lot of work on agriculture, both marginal agriculture as well as the typical chemical intensive agriculture. And it turns out that agricultural fields can be a really good place for bird diversity. And there are a lot of water birds and dryland birds that actually use agriculture. And of course, intensive pesticide use can be really harmful to them. But there are a lot of places in India where, I think 85% of our farmers actually are marginal farmers who can't afford pesticides, and they don't use a lot of it. So these tracts across India actually are quite good for agriculture. So I think to generalize and to think that agriculture would be really damaging across the board, that's not true. Just like the way that we use our forests, some kinds of use of forests is bad for birds, some kinds of use are good. Similarly, there's a whole range of agricultural practices that could be good and bad for birds. And we need to look at this question in much more micro detail and, in specific specific to certain geographies and so on, and certain agricultural practices. For instance, recently there is a study in Condor by a couple of scientists from NCF who've shown a whole gradient in bird diversity from tea plantations to teak, taking into account June plots, shifting cultivation plots, as well as primary rainforest and oil palm. And what they found is that oil palm and tea are at the bottom of the list, but shifting cultivation plots and rainforests are actually on top, and shifting cultivation plots are not that bad, compared to rainforests. So yeah, we need to look at this with a much more detailed way.
Do you have anything to add, Umesh?
No.
I wanted to add, what about the pesticides and fertilizers that we use? Like, are they universally bad, or like generally speaking, because they affect the insect communities, right? Found in these landscapes.
Yeah, definitely. So that's what I'm saying. Certain kinds of agriculture with heavy pesticide use are bound to be really bad. We don't have enough studies about it. We need to study that much more, but we also need to look at marginal agriculture, which uses less pesticide and more compost and things like that, and which may not be so bad. And I think this is a very important question also, because instead of just talking about protected areas and about, very pristine, so-called pristine habitats, we need to talk about the larger landscape where people live, used forests and agriculture and so on. And if we learn more about these systems, we can actually develop better policies about how to conserve our bird diversity and everything else that goes with it.
Great. Thank you so much for speaking in this webinar. I think it was a really, really insightful discussion. I wish it could have gone on for longer, but I think we're out of time now. So yeah, thank you so much. Do you guys have any closing statements for our audience? I think a lot of the audience are like enthusiastic bird watchers and, people who are generally working in different areas of wildlife. So if you guys have any like closing statements. Maybe you can just say individually, what can we all do?
Like I said earlier, I think we're living in a time where we all need to get involved in some way, either as researchers or as advocates, or as part of pressure groups that can convince the government to kind of take this issue seriously, because it's going to affect biodiversity. It's going to affect us sooner or later. So I would say get involved.
Yeah, and I would like just to add to what Ghazala said, in that successful pressure campaigns generally require coming together of a diverse group of people with various skills. You need people who are well versed with the media, you need artists, you need designers, you need, educationers. Just scientists or bird watchers doing it alone is not going to cut it. It's not going to make any difference at all, because we are considered a fringe section of society. And so what we actually need to do is to craft these very, very effective and intelligent campaigns that actually can put pressure on the government.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what you said. So yeah, thank you so much, guys. We'll end the webinar here.
Thank you for having us.
For hosting us, and thank you, Vinni, for moderating this.
Yeah, thank you, Vinni, for organizing this, and others at CWS. Thank you.